Hello, everybody. Welcome to Comedian MTG. My name is Ian. You know what? We're leaving it in. On this week's video, I was thinking about what to do because there wasn't any major tournaments this last weekend as far as like big 64 plus player tournaments. So I was on the most recent episode of the Mind Sculptors, which for those who are watching this will be coming out on December 11th, 2023. So you might be seeing this beforehand, you might not be. But on that episode, we are talking about high mana value commanders. And one of the things that struck me was I was talking about this Tiamat deck. And for those who don't know, a lot of the conversation about 5-color food chain when it came to Tiamat was that, you know, it would be a sort of adjacent card to the food chain for Sliver, and that it could basically be another 5-color food chain commander, right? So the way it's traditionally been played has been that Tiamat has this like several card dragon package that if you hard cast Tiamat, you can go like get this dragon combo basically. And to me, that didn't feel like the most necessary way to play it. And one of the reasons I kind of like Tiamat is that if you go through this version that I'm going to kind of pitch in this episode, you can basically play Emil Dockside combos and play food chain, which I thought was actually pretty enticing. And the way it's been built previously has meant that you can't do all these things and also play ad nauseam in the deck. But I think there's a way to play it where you basically only have to play like 1 or 2 expensive dragons so that you can actually play like high card quality version of this deck. So that's kind of the conceit of what I'm doing today, and I'm sort of going to be brewing it live. So apologies to Callahan for all the weird pauses you're going to have to see me take, but this is kind of the idea of this brew. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put 30 lands in here. It's not really exactly going to be, the lands is not actually something I can put, but I'm going to put 30 island in here just to start things off. So the initial conceit of this deck is that, well, let's add a fast mana package, which is one of the things I have here on Moxfield. I can just add some fast mana so I don't have to go through the process of typing those all out. This is probably not going to be a Jeweled Lotus deck, so I'll throw that considering board. We have the basics of the fast mana here, but let's talk about the win cons, right? So we talked about food chain being one that I want to be able to use here with this deck. And with that, it probably means we, at the very least, will be playing Squee, the Immortal, the very nice food chain outlet we have there. I also mentioned that I want Emil Dockside combos, which I think is actually pretty sick. So one thing I'm doing right now is actually went over to EDH Rec and looked for dragons because I know for a fact there is a certain dragon I'm trying to look for. Scourge of Valkis is one of these potential dragons, but I think Terror of the Peaks, here we go. Yeah, this is the one I was looking for, which is going to be our outlet. So it says spells your opponent controls a target. Terror of the Peaks costs an additional 3 life to cast. And whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals damage equal to that creature's power to any target. So basically, if you play Tiamat, you use some of the infinite creature mana to play Terror of the Peaks, right? If you are playing Tiamat infinitely, you're able to put it on the battlefield over and over again. And with Terror of the Peaks there, which you can tutor up with Tiamat, you're able to deal infinite damage to your opponents. So Terror of the Peaks in the deck for right now, which also is kind of interesting because an infinite damage outlet here is a way for us to be able to win at instant speed, right? So if we're doing like Born Upon the Wind shenanigans, we can definitely do that at instant speed. Now, one thing that would concern me a little bit of this deck is like what happens if we exile Terror of the Peaks. So I kind of want to look at a second potential dragon outlet for the deck that can work with our food chain win, right? So the easy answer is to just probably play this one up here, Scourge of Valkis. It says when it or another dragon enters the battlefield and your control deals X damage to any target where X is the number of dragons you control, and you can pay red to give it fire breathing, right? Let's try and use you as our second outlet here, but I also kind of like the idea of like seeing if there's a higher card quality option. So I'm gonna head over to Scryfall and check under the dragon category, right? So see, these cards are dragons, and do a little search here, and I'm gonna obviously do some of the higher ranked ones just to give it a little ease for myself personally. Now, obviously we can play some value dragons in this deck, like Niv Mizzet and stuff like that, but I don't think that's quite necessary. And actually, I'm gonna see if we can sort it by mana value, right? Because I said part of the conceit of this was to maybe get a dragon that won't cost us $1 million, and by that I mean 1 million mana, and a dragon that is going to allow for a lower ad nauseam curve, right? So not seeing anything too crazy yet. Nadar actually works with Emil, which is kind of interesting, but that's not quite what we need. Yeah, so I'm already here up to the 5 drops on Scryfall, so it looks like the Scourge of Valkis is going to be our necessary evil as far as backup dragons is concerned, right? So that's totally fine. The next thing we're doing here is recognizing that we are in a 5-color deck. So I'm gonna start adding some of the things I find most necessary when it comes to 5-color decks. The first of all is we're playing black, so I wanna get all those tutors in that are just the most important, right? So we're talking about Imperial Seal, Demonic Tutor, sometimes Diabolic Intent, and if that one doesn't end up working out with our deck, we can put it on the sideboard as always. And Vampiric Tutor are our black ones. Now, as we can very much see from this deck, I mean, first of all, it's a food chain deck, right? So we want our Demonic Consultation because of how well that works with food chain and Tainted Pact as well. And of course, if we are adding these, we might as well include our Thassa's Oracle. I guess while we're also looking here at these dragons, we should probably look at Changeling as well. Yeah, so it looks like the Changeling route's a little bit of an underwhelming one as well, but it's always worth exploring these things. You find it very that Orvar can be found with this. Okay, so now that we have our Thoric lines and our tutors for black, we talked about how important it is that this deck can use Dockside and Emil combos. So for me, that means I want to add my green tutors as well. So that means my Worldly Tutors. I'm also thinking Invasion of Ikoria as well, and then Finale of Devastation, all of which kind of do the same thing. I think we are even safe playing something like Eladamri's Call as just a powerful instant speed tutor for whatever the best creature in our deck is, which is 90% of the time going to be Dockside Extortionist. It is worth mentioning now at this point in the deck tech that I think we can abuse the fact that we're in 5 colors to just be playing some generically good cards. So for example, we want to talk about our Esper Sentinels, right? Our card advantage is so important in cEDH, and let's use it to our fullest potential. So Rhystic Study as well, get our card draw on. We have the new The One Ring. Obviously I'm going to be putting in Remora as well, Mystic, Remora. You know, just all of our card draw staples in the format. I think it's also safe while we're this early in the brew. Let's try something like Talion, the Kindly Lord, as far as card draw is concerned. And then, you know, if we have to make some cuts later because we decide we want to be a little more aggressive with our Nas curve, that's something we can maybe take a peek at as well. Right now, we only have the one enabler for food chain in Squee the Immortal, but I think the card quality of this list is high enough where we really don't have to worry about redundancy in that department. I also think we're a 5-color deck in the modern cEDH metagame, so I really don't see a problem with maybe playing Underworld Breach lines as well. So for now, we have our Intuition package, again, Intuition, Underworld Breach, we have our Brain Freeze, our Alliance Eye Diamond, and of course our Savine's Reclamation rounding out that package. So right now we've got a lot of different ways to win the game. We've got Underworld Breach lines, we've got Food Chain lines, we've got Demonic Consultation, Thassa's Oracle. I'm really liking the amount of layering in this deck, as long as the fact that we kind of get to play this cool 5-color commander. This deck is definitely striking me as sort of like, what if we jammed as many infinite mana combos in one deck as possible? And I'm kind of all about it. I think it's pretty fun as far as concepts are concerned. So this one's pretty sick. You know, I'm wondering here, thinking about, do we need more Dockside combos than just Emil? I think Emil is so efficient that we don't really need to go super hard into the Dockside lines right now, but it's definitely something I want to be thinking about moving forward with this deck. Another thing I want to do just while we are playing this combo soup list is play Teferi the Time Raveler. Now this, combined with Displacer Kitten, as many people know, is a 2-card combo. Just being a sort of combo soup deck is very, very entertaining to me, so that's what we're going to be going with as far as the angle is concerned. Now we have Teferi here, we must also have Grand Abolisher, right? We want to make sure that when we attempt to win this game, with our combo soup list, we're going to be doing that, right? We want to be making sure that these wins are happening. And speaking of that mentality with the deck, let's start focusing a little bit on interaction, right? I think we need to be focusing on things like Flusterstorm, an offer you can't refuse, Swan Song. Those are the main 3 as far as like initial 1-drop interaction is concerned. I also have been a fan of Dispel for a really long time, so I'll throw it in here for now. Another thing to always be thinking about is our free spells. So I have our Force of Will and our Force of Negation. Also, we're talking about Pact of Negation. This is a very proactive combo deck. I'm down to play Pact as well. Also, with a 7-mana commander, we are definitely not going to be playing Fierce Guardianship and Deflecting Swat. So that's something worth noting because this deck is going to struggle against those cards for sure. We also should not forget about our Mind Break Trap, as that card has put in a ton of work in the format up to now. Oh, and my last one that I always forget for just a little bit too long is Mental Misstep. I think in a deck like this one, you can't really afford to skip out on a card like that. Now we can definitely play more interaction as we go through this deck. Obviously, a super awesome include is the card Silence, which is also making me wonder if we can afford a Ranger Captain of Eos here in the creature spots. While we are talking about creatures that are pretty cheap, I'm kind of inclined to maybe play a Mana Dork or two. Not too crazy into the Mana Dork plan, but maybe like the 3 best ones in my opinion, which would just be Birds of Paradise, Ignoble Hierarch, and Noble Hierarch. I know a lot of people also like Deathrite Shaman, but the inconsistency on that card, I'm not gonna lie, skeeves me out a little bit. So the question is, do I think I can fit a Ranger Captain of Eos in here? It is a double white spell, but the card is just too strong, and I think it's gonna end up making the cut for sure. It's just too good at what it does, which is silencing your opponents or silencing to protect your combos. I think it's just insanely efficient, to be honest. While we're in talking about some of the most valuable cards in these colors right now, I think, honestly, Smothering Tithe has been putting in a ton of work in the format right now. And honestly, it's just, creating a ton of situations where it's providing a lot of value over and over again. So I'm a little bit hesitant to not include this card. It's been putting in a ton of work. So and for that reason alone, I think Smothering Tithe makes the cut. Now, it is worth noting for this deck that there is an argument to potentially looking into some dragons that are infinite mana outlets in a different light. So for example, thinking about combos like Isochron Scepter, right? For example, Tiamat and the Scourge of Valkis and the Terror of the Peaks, they don't win with infinite mana through Isochron Scepter, right? You can play your Tiamat, but none of these dragons here allow you to sort of pop off with infinite mana. Now, this is kind of one of those reasons that it might be worth it to think about Niv Mizzet Parun, right? Niv Mizzet is not only an infinite mana outlet that can work with something like Isochron Scepter being able to generate infinite mana. Niv Mizzet is something that will be able to trigger on each iteration of those spells. Now, I don't think going Turbo Niv Mizzet is really the way to go with this deck, but I think it's interesting to maybe look for dragons that could be infinite mana outlets for infinite mana combos that don't quite fit into the same role that they already have here. It might be a good way to not run something like Scourge of Valkis. So finding a dragon that is an infinite mana outlet that might be able to allow you to basically draw your deck. Now, I think that's probably a strategy that might be a little more important in scenarios in which you are not trying to potentially squeeze in an ad nos plan, which we had talked about doing for this deck. So that might be a bit of a different reality, but it's definitely at least something worth thinking about. I know Korvold works specifically with the Dockside combos in the deck, but does not work with something like an Isochron Scepter combo, right? It is also worth noting that if you are not focusing on your ad nos curve in a deck like this one, cards like Sword Coast Serpent are actually pretty interesting because they allow you to use your triggers to be able to like tutor up things like a bounce spell, which you can do here with the Sword Coast Serpent, which is a fun sort of way to convert these. It's funny, this other Niv Mizzet is also kind of interesting in this respect because it actually has an infinite mana outlet tacked onto it as an activated ability. So, at any time you can be able to just, pump a bunch of infinite mana in here and just like one damage your opponents to death, which is kind of funny. So maybe that's something we at least put in the sideboard. So I think, now at this point in the deck tech, I want to make sure we are pushing our deck to be as competitive as possible. And sometimes that means pushing so that we have a solid acceleration plan in the deck, right? We are being a cEDH deck that is focusing on turboing out some pretty intense combos. So with that in mind, let's start looking at ways to accelerate our game plan a little bit. I'm thinking of the Spirit Guides, right? So for example, Simian Spirit Guide, able to accelerate our game plan. How about Elvish Spirit Guide as well? Then I'm also thinking of cards like Rite of Flame and Dark Ritual, right? All different ways to really accelerate our game plan. And these ones are not specifically tied to any sort of Turbo Nos strategy, although cards like Dark Rit obviously accelerate very well into that type of strategy. So let's take a look at our curve right now. Yeah, we have a 1.29, and knowing this deck, as soon as we start adding a few more high mana value things, I feel like our ad nos curve might be a little suspect. So let's add ad nauseum for now. but just keep in mind that there's a chance it does not make the final cut of this deck list, seeing as, some of the mid-range game plans in here can be a little pushing towards that. With all of these early accelerants, I definitely want to have some of my 2-mana mana rocks in this deck. So Arcane Signet is definitely one that is going to make the cut here, as well as Fellwire Stone. Obviously, auto includes in a lot of these 5-color options. We're up to 10 artifacts here. One that I definitely did not include up to this point was Wishclaw Talisman, which is definitely one we should be including in this archetype. Right now, we are only up to 11 artifacts, which is really not a ton. So I'm kind of in this debating point of like, are we going to push this deck enough to where we are feeling comfortable playing cards like Mox Opal and stuff like that? Or is it going to be one where we are just sort of a mid-range archetype as far as artifact package is concerned and not overcommitting to an artifact plan? I know, for example, a lot of the mid-range Kenrith lists that have been played a lot lately tend to not really go too hard into those variants. So, for example, the King's Kitten by PTD, which is a 5-color deck I have a lot of respect for. And just kind of looking at a deck like this, is you see in this PTD variant, he is not on Ad Nauseam, but he is playing like this sort of medium speed artifact package, right? Like not going as hard as going into things like Mox Opal and stuff like that. So it is worth noting that that is sort of a thought process in this variant of this deck. Now, obviously, these are different decks and they are going to operate on different axes. But, it's definitely good to look at stuff that's very similar to what you're working with and kind of get an idea from this. One thing I do want to point out that I think is actually probably really worth including in this deck is the sort of naming convention behind this deck, which is the King's Kitten aspect, right? Referring specifically to Displacer Kitten Luris or Displacer Kitten Eternal Witness combos, but specifically with Luris, because the way Luris works in this function is if we had add a Luris to this deck, Luris is able to create a few combos with Displacer Kitten, because what's going to happen is with either Lion's Eye Diamond or Lotus Petal, you can play those with Luris and then use that ability to flicker the Displacer Kitten, allowing Luris to once again cast a thing from the graveyard. So now suddenly you can crack that Lotus Petal, and Luris has not activated this turn. You use that to play the Lotus Petal in the graveyard, and Displacer Kitten will once again be able to flicker it accordingly. So Luris and Displacer Kitten plus either of those artifacts are actually combos. And the fact that Luris is just a nice value card, right? If you get your Thassa's Oracle or Dockside in the graveyard somehow, this seems like a pretty solid way to get them back. Now, I did notice in that King's Kitten list that our pilot was on cards like Eldritch Evolution and Neoform, which I definitely don't hate in this deck, especially with these few mana dorks that we have here. Although I'm going to pause myself and add a Ragavan to this deck as well. It's not exactly a mana dork, but man, Ragavan has not failed to impress me in quite some time. I know later in the game, the board states can get a little gummed up and people will happily trade their resources for Ragavan, but honestly, the early game value and technical card advantage that it gives you has made it really worth my time as far as including. And in this deck, with the amount of value creatures we are kind of looking at, I really don't hate including this Ragavan here and maybe looking into that Neoform and Eldritch Evolution package that we were just referring to. Although I will say it's a little awkward in this deck, given the fact that we have this sort of disparity between 3-drops and 4-drops and 1-drops in the deck. There are very few 2-drops that I want to convert to other 1-drops and things like that. So maybe I'm sort of doubting my own decision making here in this process, and maybe we'll save that for another time. I will say one of the best reasons to be playing green in the current metagame, especially associated with black, is to be able to play Culling Ritual. This card has been putting in a ton of work, and I really think it's earned its inclusion in this archetype for sure. I'm also almost tempted, if we end up going with a different version of this deck, there's also maybe a little bit of an argument to look at cards like Hullbreaker Horror as well. I can definitely see this card, ending up in situations where, and maybe this is just a soft spot because of how much I've enjoyed it in Tevesh Krom lately, but the idea that a Hullbreaker Horror, and I'm going to put it in the sideboard here, could just come down in the mid game, and I don't think people would anticipate you playing a card like that in this deck, but I think the idea of that is really appealing to me. I think also one thing that we definitely missed out on is Tinderwall in this deck. I think, the idea that if Rite of Flame is good enough in a deck like this, Tinderwall also has to be good enough in a deck like this. I will also say cards like Rite of Flame and Tinderwall and Elvish Spirit Guide and Simian Spirit Guide do best when they can convert into talismans. So the idea that we only have Arcane Signet and Felwar Stone right now may be a little too few with those type of effects. So I'm going to go down here to our color pie breakdown and see what colors are most dominant. Right now it seems we have a heavy blue, black, white, green as far as the breakdown is concerned. Yeah, it's actually pretty interesting. Blue and black definitely seem to be the most dominant colors, with the green and white being the definite secondary as well. So for sure, I'm going to be putting in a Talisman of Dominance, affecting our blue-black color breakdown, and then maybe having the Talisman of Progress, the blue-white one, as our secondary one, just because of the fact that we have Grand Abolisher and Ranger Captain of Eos to consider as far as our mana base is concerned. Now that we're at 13 artifacts, I'm starting to be at the place where I am more and more considering adding Mox Opal into the deck, and I think we are going to be crossing that threshold for me personally. So Mox Opal, welcome to the team. I hope that you are going to be more helpful than you're going to be hurtful. We'll also say I think we're a little light on specifically targeted removal in this deck right now, so I think maybe an Abrupt Decay is going to make its way into the deck. We also have to note that we're at 98 cards already, but I do think we are at 30 lands, which is definitely way more than I want to be playing in this deck, and I think I'd be comfortable with a clean 28, which would put us around what Blue Farm plays nowadays. I think also to recognize that Orcish Bowmasters is sort of just a very dominant staple in the format at the current moment, and to sort of exclude that card would be a pretty tough sell for me right now in this deck. Another thing to shout out as far as the Niv Mizzet Draco Genius approach, once again, if we are playing a little bit of a different version of this deck that is more focused on the infinite mana combo potential, I think I like the idea of, if I'm going to go down the Draco Genius route, the Auriok Salvagers is another card, and I'll throw it in the sideboard here, along with the Isochron Scepter, to really display some of these combos that we've talked about. So as we can see, Auriok Salvagers, if you have Lion's Eye Diamond, is able to make infinite mana, which is obviously something that is going to be very, very powerful. And, you know, it's one of those combos that is kind of resilient. It does involve that you exile or not exile, but discard your whole hand. So obviously it definitely comes with a bit of a downside, but, you know, if you're already playing Breach Lines and things like that, it's kind of clean to be able to go for it. Also, speaking of clean conversions to winning the game, I kind of like the idea of playing a defense grid in this deck. I know we have Grand Abolisher, Ranger Captain, and the card Silence to be able to do that, but I think defense grid is just one of the cleanest ways to be able to go for it, especially because it is 2 colorless mana. So in a 5-color deck, we don't really have to be worrying about our colors. And maybe let's just add a defense grid to say, hey, I'm going to be winning the game in this very, very, you know, combo heavy deck. I will say this deck definitely is playing a lot of combos. And speaking of the fact that this deck is kind of combo heavy, I like the idea that if we are playing Orcish Bowmasters, if we are playing Smothering Tithe, and maybe if we ever get to a point where we want to consider Notion Thief, which I will once again put in the sideboard of this list, I kind of like the idea of including one wheel. I've been a really big fan of including Wheel of Fortune as the only wheel in certain archetypes. You know, there are going to be times where you have to mulligan way lower than you originally wanted to. And I think in those situations, having just one wheel to be able to convert to a win is actually really strong. I will say also we've gotten this far in the deck tech without Gamble and Mystical Tutor, so we are definitely at the point where we got to start talking about potential cuts for this deck. Oh, well, I can't put them in at the same time. Oh, and Enlightened Tutor as well. Yikes. So we've added a few tutors to the deck, and now we are already up at 102 cards, so some adjustments do have to be made. I think 28 lands is probably the lowest we can go with this deck at this point, so definitely some cards gotta get the cut here. The question is, what cards do get cut? We definitely need to keep these guys as our outlet pieces. I like the Displacer Kitten stuff a lot in this deck. I like that it combos with Luris. I like that, you know, it combos well with Dockside. I like a lot of Displacer Kitten stuff. And I like that it works with Teferi as well. Going down here to Diabolic Intent, we do have a decent amount of creatures to sacrifice, I will say it really only yields to like Birds of Paradise, Ignoble, Noble, Ragavan, Dockside at times, which actually can be a decent amount of value. And then like the Orcish Bowmaster's token, so maybe not the most amount of cards for Diabolic Intent. And honestly, in decks like these where there's not the most amount of cards to throw away to a card like that, I tend to lean towards not playing it because I'd rather, you know, have opportunities where I've missed out on one Diabolic Intent as opposed to seeing it rot in my hand and then have to sacrifice a high value creature when I can't really afford to do so. Also in decks like Blue Farm, I know people will play it sometimes. I'm a little off it in decks like that. And the fact that we don't really have a commander that we can sacrifice pretty efficiently to this card. So I'm very happy to at least sideboard it for now. I will say the fact that we are on Cabal Ritual and Ad Nauseam and not having, or we're not on Cabal Ritual with Ad Nauseam and Culling Ritual in the deck is definitely making me a little nervous for sure. So that one's going to also be in the sideboard, but as I said, we are making cuts to this deck, not adding more stuff. So let's try not to go too crazy in the opposite direction. And you know, it's funny, now that I've gone through this entire process, I'm now realizing that Lurrus of the Dream Den is actually like Auriok Salvagers and Isochron Scepter, where it doesn't actually work that well in this deck because you get to a point where you are infinitely casting the Displacer Kitten, you're making infinite mana through the Lotus Petal line, and now I'm realizing it actually doesn't create a situation where you can infinitely flicker Tiamat and then therefore infinitely flicker your dragon. So actually, we will be not including that in this deck. Well, okay, wait. So I'm correcting myself once again, because what you can actually do is create a scenario where you have Displacer Kitten, Lurrus, and the Petal like we talked about, make infinite mana, play your commander, then go grab Terror of the Peaks, play that card, and then go back to the loop, because every time that Displacer Kitten will flicker Lurrus, it will actually trigger Terror of the Peaks. Okay, that actually works. I'm also now just realizing that we had mentioned earlier in this episode two cards that I find to be extremely important if we are trying to push for a tempo-y game plan in the format right now, which is Born Upon the Wind and Final Fortune. And to be honest, if we're playing a very proactive infinite mana combo deck, I don't think I would feel confident not playing these cards. So we're kind of back to the drawing board as far as these cards are concerned. We have 103 cards in the deck, and there's definitely some cards that are standing out potentially cuttable for me. Right now, Smothering Tithe is one of those cards. I think we have a lot of interesting ways to be able to, you know, push our mana so that we get our commander out, but like our commander doesn't ever really convert to card advantage. So Smothering Tithe, despite potentially being very strong, is just going to be better in a lot of other decks that I think exist in the format right now. So I'm feeling pretty comfortable with that cut, and also respecting that cut, keeping Wheel of Fortune in, because as I mentioned, it doesn't really get rid of the scenarios we talked about. Yes, it's one less combo with Wheel of Fortune, but at the same time, Wheel of Fortune is just going to be there, especially in a deck where we don't have inherent card advantage in the command zone. Wheel of Fortune is good to be able to help reset if things go terribly awry. We have two more cuts here, and gosh, this is actually really tough. I will say we do have a lot of top deck tutors, but each and every one of those top deck tutors is so good, it makes me really hesitant to cut any of them, which is sad because I feel like some of them could be some pretty nice cuts here and there. There may be an argument to look more towards our mana dorks and that they're maybe not as worth it as cards like Birds and Tinderwall. So maybe Ignoble and Noble could go, or even Ragavan itself, and maybe those end up being the correct cuts for this deck. But I'm definitely not feeling fantastic about pursuing that avenue specifically. However, that being said, I kind of like the idea of having a clean go-to cut right now, so maybe these two bite the bullet, and we'll see if when going through some maybe opening hands with this deck, if it's able to, you know, still work without those mana dorks present. But I'll definitely keep them in mind as we go through these. I will also say, let's get the mana base going for this deck. So the easiest way to do it is to be able to add fetch lands, right? Very easy to just add the full fetch land package to this deck. Now there's a lot of modern thinking in cEDH nowadays where you actually don't include the least played colors in the deck, which would, it sounds like it's averaging out to like green and red in this list, but I think for right now, it's actually relatively balanced as far as 5-color decks are concerned, so I don't want to really go hacking away at some of these lands yet. But let's go to our 5-color lands like City of Brass. I like the Mana Confluence. I think this is a deck that, oop, these are going to the sideboard for some reason. I also think this is a deck where Forbidden Orchard has a lot less downside than with decks like Timna and whatnot in Najeela, so I'm very happy to play that card. Exotic Orchard as well. The iconic Commander staple, Command Tower. Everyone's favorite colorless land, Ancient Tomb. Everyone's favorite, hopefully not colorless land, Gemstone Caverns. And these are sort of the auto staples that I get to. Now it starts to get a little bit more complicated. And let's add some of those dual lands. So we talked about how some of the original duals, I'm gonna auto add all of them in and maybe, you know, look at where the deck lands at this point. You know, by adding one of each dual land, as we mentioned, this is a relatively balanced 5-color deck. It brings us all the way up to 27 lands. So I am feeling pretty good about that. And once again, noting that Taiga is probably the worst dual land in the deck, but once again, as far as 5-color lands go, this is a pretty balanced deck, and I would not feel bad about, you know, maybe including a kind of balanced dual land mana base like this. And then finally, let's round it out with a Watery Grave, really doubling up on the fact that our blue-black is our most common color combination in this deck, and really solidifying that angle for sure. But this is the deck as we have it right now. I think the best thing to do at this point is maybe do a couple test hands, kind of get a rough idea of what kind of hands I'd be looking for in a deck like this, and go from there. This hand strikes me as a little bit slow. We could potentially, you know, gamble into some stuff, but if we whiff on our Worldly Tutor and things like that, I think we'd be in a kind of bad spot. Also, in this series, I will definitely roll to see what position I am for situations like this one, where we have a Gemstone Caverns in our opening hand. This hand's actually kind of insane because we can Gemstone Caverns, and pitching away a card here, probably the Lurrus, as it's the least impactful card to the game plan we have going here. I mean, I see Dark Ritual, Mystical Tutor, and I think this hand is a pretty early Ad Nauseam. Now, I don't think if we can play an Ad Nauseam as early as turn 1, but if we looked at the deck as we had it, I don't think it's going to be a deck that Ad Nauseams very well turn 1. So I do like the idea of, I mean, we could also just Mystical Tutor, go for it, and then pass the turn, but there's also a world where we hold up and don't actually Mystical Tutor before our first turn and just hope that, you know, our game plan kind of feeds itself a little bit. So we draw for turn. Oh, Dockside doesn't hurt any situation here. We can play the Soul Ring and then hold up the Mystical Tutors to surprise our opponents. That way next turn we can play Dockside, play Dark Ritual, play Ad Naus, and hopefully win that game for sure. New game here. Let's see what seat we're in. 2. All right, we're going second. I can't keep a hand like this because you need lands to play the game, huh? There's another one's a little bit land light and doesn't really have a game plan going, so we'll go to 6 here. This one's pretty slow. I can't really do anything for at least until turn 3, so I'm not really excited about this one. Oof, this is our 5, and honestly, we have no fast mana in it, not really seeing anything in a lot of our higher drops, so time to go to 4. Okay, our 4 is actually pretty decent. Now, a card like Teferi is really good early game, but not really great in the later game. This hand strikes me as a kind of hand where you go get a Tundra on turn 1, play a Mana Crypt turn 2, and hopefully play a Rhystic Study and then keep some of this free counter magic to either protect your Rhystic Study or be able to interact with your opponents on their turns. All right, so going last. Now that does affect things because going last means that we kind of have to be a little greedy. I think this hand here kind of looks like it could be something, but I think it's actually a bit of a trap. I don't think it actually really does much. So let's go to second 7. Second 7 is a Grand Abolisher and a bunch of counter spells. No, thank you. 6 is kind of interesting. We do kind of have the potential to open up with a Gemstone Caverns, exiling our own Squee, which is always a fun play pattern and one that I enjoy quite a little bit. It is a 6, so I'm kind of tempted to shift the Mental Misstep to the bottom of our library because, you know, going in last seat and also being on a lower mulligan already with a Gemstones, basically starting us off with a 5-card hand. I don't really feel like we're obligated to play Table Police if we're in last going down to 6 cards already. So I'm down to put Mental Misstep to the bottom, start by exiling the Squee to the Gemstones, and then either A, we can try and do some crazy stuff with Dockside, we can go for Intuition Breach lines, or we can use Intuition to actually get our pieces of the Food Chain combo because Squee is already there in our exile zone. Let's get one last hand here. Going forth again, yikes. All right, this hand, I mean, this one's actually pretty easy, pretty solid. We have our Esper Sentinel here, able to come out turn 1 while playing a Lotus Petal. We can get really greedy early in the game, try and cast Demonic Consultation and name Food Chain. Maybe we'll hit Squee in the process and be able to go from there. Or we have the ability to decon pretty early on and have Tainted Pact and Thassa's Oracle in the hand. We can also switch the order on that, so you're going for Tainted Pact first to then be able to consult Oracle. And you know, if things get a little bit slower, we can use Tainted Pact to find some value, and hopefully Esper Sentinel grinds us out. So yeah, at the end of the day, this is just kind of a high, hard quality 5-color Food Chain / infinite mana combo deck, with the downside of having to play 2 kind of mediocre dragons in the 99, and the upside of being able to play this sort of 5-color saucy good stuff, and just sort of have, you know, the equivalent of a Kenrith deck plus Food Chain minus 2 good cards. That's kind of the idea of what we ended up here with this deck. But I don't know, this was a fun experiment. I kind of thought Tiamat has been built one very specific way from time to time, so why not add a little spice, add a little variety, and try this version of basically like high card quality Tiamat to see if this is a potentially viable strategy. And I definitely think I'm excited to give this list a potential try. I like the idea of a 5-color deck that can use Food Chain, can use Emil, and also has all of the good stuff options in this 5-color deck. So what do y'all think of this list? What do you guys think? Is this a type of brew thing you would like to see often here on the channel, where I kind of get the concept and start from the very beginning? Or do you want to keep it more to traditional lists that I try at tournaments? Let me know in the comments down below. I actually enjoy these quite a lot. You know, at the end of the day, a tournament player is something I've definitely become here on this channel, but a brewer in cEDH is always where I started, and I do love a good cEDH brew. Let me know your feelings in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching. And also, if you would like to find out more about cEDH coaching, you can always email me at comedianmtg@gmail.com. You can find me on Discord and Twitter. The coaching is basically what I do professionally nowadays, and it's my favorite thing. I love doing it, and I've had so many folks who have had such great reactions to the coaching. So many people have been DMing me, you know, after the weekend being like, hey, I was able to make a deep run in the tournament because of this. So if that's something that interests you, please feel free to reach out. Thank you all for watching this week's video, and I'll catch you next time.